Budget season is upon us. Are you ready to employ all that specialized training you received in seminary? What you didn't, well, if you're feeling out of your depth, we have got 3 overlooked strategies for you this budget season. Stay with us on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I am joined by my friend and co-host AJ Matthew. AJ, thanks for joining me on the podcast
Scott,
today.
It is a fine day on the podcast, and I'm happy to be here as usual.
Absolutely. We're talking about budgeting, and I loved the teaser. Churches don't prepare seminaries don't prepare pastors to lead a budget. And that's why so many pastors are really glad that they've got a finance team or some other committee that they can sort of delegate the budgeting process to.
Or any warm body with a calculator in some cases.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Have you ever opened QuickBooks ever before? Do you know what that is?
You're
hired. That's right. The inherent problem with this is that the folks who are serving on your finance team might know a lot about how to manage money, but they don't have necessarily the same perspective that you as the pastor or certainly your staff have on the impact of what resourcing your ministry looks like. Mm-hmm. And so the number of times, AJ, that we hear pastors say things like, well, we would do that, but I don't think I could get that through the finance committee, or this is a good idea, but I just don't know that we have the money, or these kinds of problems come up a lot. Mm-hmm. And it's the direct result of pastors not having a lot of hand in the development of the budget very often.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say?
That's a great point. I mean, because a lot of finance committees seem to be like, the purpose of the finance committee is to save money and make sure bills get paid. And, introducing anything outside of that, a lot of them end up with a lot of power in nope, can't do that. And well, wait a minute, we're a church. What are we here for? What exactly is our purpose, and what should we be spending money on? So it really is a foreign concept to be funding fruitful ministry with great outputs instead of let's just make sure that the bills get paid. And since we don't have any extra money, the answer is no.
Right. Imagine this, and I know it's not totally analogous, AJ, so forgive the fact, listeners, that this isn't a totally fair analogy. But imagine you were running a business, let's say you're running a restaurant. You got a pizza restaurant, so you've got employees there who are responsible for ordering flour and tomatoes and all these kinds of things, and making the pizzas and making sure that there's napkins and all of this. So they're running the operations. You got a manager, even a general manager of the restaurant, who's responsible for hiring waiters and waitresses and making that things are running smoothly. Okay, but then imagine that the budget for this restaurant is determined by a group of volunteers who like to go to the restaurant. They're deciding how much money you have to spend on sauce and flour and napkins, and you go, well, that's ridiculous. The general manager should at least be sitting in that meeting, right? Because don't they know how much needs to be spent on napkins and how many servers need to be hired and this kind of thing? Wouldn't that person have the best perspective on it? And you go, oh, no, for accountability's sake, we're afraid that the general manager might be stealing money, or could steal money, or could ask for more money than he needs. So really, we should get a group of people who like to attend the restaurant and put them in charge of putting the budget together. You would say that's foolish.
Board.
Yeah. So I know that that's crazy, and it's not totally analogous, because the people who are on your finance committee aren't just random people who like to come to your church, but it's the lack of involvement by the people who are involved in the daily operations of the organization. The disconnect between those people and the resourcing and the budgeting of the church, to me, is always I always find it a little bit insane in the churches where this is the case. I'm going, hold on a minute. The folks who are making financial decisions have some of the least perspective on what's actually necessary for running it. So all that to say, that's not even one of our main points here, AJ.
Unfortunately, yes, this episode is not even about how to change that situation. So
the only reason I bring all this up to begin with is we're going to empower you with 3 overlooked strategies during the budget season, but a sort of a prerequisite to this is you'd have to be involved in the budgeting. For you to leverage these strategies, you'd have to decide, I'm going to take an active participating role in the budgeting process. If you're not involved in the budgeting process, these strategies are largely useless to you.
Yeah. Now, most pastors do at least, they're not completely devoid of participation. So hopefully,
I see it.
Hopefully you at least are talking about, some of the major funding things. So yeah, let's go ahead and move into our first point here. And that is to under budget to alleviate pressure. And so is already, the dividing lines are being drawn now in our listeners, Scott, as to, those that are already super cautious and they're like, right on, man. I mean, we are barely going to budget for anything, and it's all gravy if it comes in. And then there's the others that are like, oh my gosh, you just threw the Bible out the window because the Bible says to always budget by faith. And we're like, yeah, I remember that verse. Not. So, you know what? Yes, living by faith. We want to live by faith. There's no doubt about it. But we also want to be strategic in making and maturing disciples of Jesus. And Scott, I think the biggest takeaway out of this, maybe it's not even like right in your face, but the pressure that pastors and other leaders, ministry leaders and staff are on because of money. And it may not be something that's always even talked about or at the forefront, but that daily pressure and certainly annual pressure of money will affect daily ministry and the effects of ministry.
Yep.
And that you cannot quantify that kind of pressure and problem that puts on somebody wanting to, minister with the word of God and reach people. And so your point here on Scott, number one simply is to don't force that on yourselves. Why put these stretch goals in on money when you could just back off a bit and take away yet another pressure point on people that are already having a hard time?
Yeah, I know we do like to walk by faith. That's a good thing. But, let's say your church, let's talk about this in very practical terms, AJ. So let's say we have a church that brings in, we're recording this in 2021. So let's just say in last year, 2020 budget year, you brought in $350,000. Great. Okay. So most churches tend to fall into one of two camps. I'd say probably the majority, I don't have any real numbers on this, by the way, I'm just based on anecdotal experience. The majority of churches will probably just budget for exactly what they brought in the year before. So if they brought in $350,000, they'll budget $350,000. There's another percentage of churches that will assume an increase, even if it's marginal, say 2, 3, 5%. Let's say 5%, they'll kind of be praying for an increase. And so they'll budget, that extra $17,000, $17,500. And then what happens is your church is on the edge. Even if you're just assuming the same amount as last year, you're really hoping. So whenever there's a fluctuation because things are down a little bit in January or things are down over the summer, you can cause a lot of stress. And so it's best, if you're able to plan for budget slightly less than what you brought in the year before. So instead of 5% more, budget 5% less. So instead of $350, which is what you brought in, target that down by to maybe $335. So not a full 5%, but like 335,000. So if you can run what you have to run, AJ, on that 5% decrease, then if there is a hiccup in giving or whatever, you're not stressed, but also you're going to be looking like you're outpacing your budget. In all likelihood, you're going to be looking like you're outpacing. And that actually, and we'll talk about this more next week probably, because we're doing another week on how to bring in money. But when something looks like it's winning and doing well, people are more likely to want to give versus if something looks like it's chronically behind. I know that's counterintuitive. You'd think if people see red, they'll go, oh, I need to give, I need to step up my giving. But not really, AJ. If people see a lot of red in those financial reports, it looks like a sinking ship and people don't want to invest in that. So don't put yourself in that position. Put yourself in a position where you're feeling like you're operating from a place of scarcity rather than a place of abundance. It's just not a great way to operate.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Hey, imagine if something like a pandemic happened. Wouldn't you be glad that you under budgeted a little bit?
That's right. Yeah, for sure.
All right. So great point there on number one. Number two, number one, sort of the setup here. Number two, sort of a couple of ways to go about this. Our second point here, defund what isn't getting discipleship results. So there's a huge assumption here, Scott, that the church has discipleship results that it's planning for. There's a new task maybe already that we're throwing on the plate of some listeners, and that is what exactly are the results that we're going for in our ministries.
We're assuming that you would be able to tell the difference between something that's working and something that's not.
Yeah.
But
so identifying
even if you've not done that work, AJ, people have a. So, for example, we'll use the analogy a lot of the cluttered garage, right? And so people know you don't have to have gone through your garage to assess everything that's in there to know our garage is cluttered. You can just look at it and go, this is a mess. I think similarly, people can look at their church, even without having assessed stuff yet, they can go, this is kind of a mess. Like it's just not working. We can't park the car in here. So, and it's a garage. That's its stated purpose is for parking a car, and we can't fit a car in there. Similarly, your church's stated purpose is to make mature disciples, and hey, we're not doing that. I think that most people can just look at their church and see just a gut check and go, is this happening here or not?
Yeah, for sure. So, being able to defund what isn't getting discipleship results obviously takes some work in
yes, that part does.
Examining the ministries that you have, looking at how they've performed over, many years, and then making determinations on what now actually with close examination is truly a resource drain and is not bearing the fruit, that would qualify it to receive that funding in this year's budget or next year's budget. So this is an area in which you might already be able to find savings by taking a hard look at how things have been performing over the last several years.
Yeah, this might be a shots fired type situation here, and I'm sorry, but there's just a lot of laziness in churches as it relates to budgeting. The baked in assumption is that we're just going to copy paste from last year. What did we do last year? That seemed fine. We'll do that next year. There's not a lot of critical thinking or strategic thinking that goes into it. And so I really encourage you to go back to episode 58 and listen to that episode about zero-based budgeting. We talk about how that's a good approach. And you don't want to assume that just because you've always done something that it's going to be fruitful for you. So I want to give a practical example for this, AJ. I did student ministry for a number of years. When I first got into ministry, I did that full time for 4 years before I moved on from it. And when I inherited a ministry that was of maybe 45 kids, something like that, 50 kids. And as I looked at all the things that our program was invested in, in terms of events that we were doing and programs that we were running. I wanted to figure out what's actually bringing the fruit, what's actually building the ministry, helping to grow students in discipleship, what's bringing in new kids, that sort of thing. One of the things that I realized is that our ministry was geared towards kids who came from wealthy families. There was so much of the ministry had an expense to it. We had so many events that it really became exclusive for churches, or families who could afford to participate in so many events. Mm-hmm. And so, it was important to me that we reorient the ministry so that any kid could participate. And that meant cutting down on some ministries. And so stripping really some things out of the budget, because even though we were charging kids for things, that was a budgetary cost or whatever to us as well. And by paring things down and streamlining that and having a real clear purpose, we were able to grow that ministry, particularly in ways that allowed kids who didn't come from wealthy backgrounds to participate and to be involved. And it gave us more resources to scholarship kids for events that they couldn't afford. But it takes some real intentionality, AJ, to do that. So we went from maybe 5 events to 3 events. And the ministry grew from 40, 50 kids to over 100 kids in the course of that 4 years. And I attribute a lot of that, well, first of all, to the Lord, but also to our team working together to pare down what we were doing fewer things better with a stated purpose. And you've got to do that. You've got to go through everything that you're doing and defund what isn't getting discipleship results. Mm-hmm.
Let's talk real quick, Scott, about what the available buckets even might be for that. We talk about 4 areas of budgeting: missions, ministry, personnel, and in like facilities or, some administration. So 70% of your budget is probably going towards your personnel and your facilities, really leaving you only with about 30%, even in flexible categories, for you to really steer your spending. But don't want to leave this podcast without talking a little bit about still your facilities and personnel costs, because even though those might be a lot of copy and paste carryover things, because you do have some fixed costs, but not all fixed costs are truly fixed. And there's a lot of available funds that you might be able to find in small contracts that you've been locked into, with different subscription services, or things like phone systems and copy machines and different things like that maybe it was a good investment at the time, might not be needed now, and maybe there's a cost savings there somewhere. Insurance, utilities, depending on where you live. All of these areas need to be looked at as often as you can, and even in personnel costs, taking a close look there at whether you've got good alignment in personnel or not. So don't just assume that what you call fixed costs are truly fixed, and have a close look at those at least every couple of years.
Yeah, man, such a good point. I think that, first of all, times change. And so some things that you feel like are fixed costs really aren't. I can give you a couple of examples, practical ones from just my own experience in working with churches and working at churches. I worked on staff at a church that continued to pay hundreds, maybe more than hundreds, maybe thousands, I'm not sure. A lot of money every year for an ad in the phone book. And that was just a recurring expense. They just did it just every year it would come through, and they would just pay it again and do it. They're just out of habit. But who's pulling out the phone book to find a church? I mean, almost no one, right? Mm-hmm. You mentioned phone systems, AJ. That's another one. If you have fewer than 5 staff, it is unlikely that you need a phone system, because they have a cell phone. I can imagine if you're like a very large church and you've got, maybe you need a phone system, but most churches don't. But almost every church has a phone system, and it's just not needed. Get one line, you're good. An office line, and you'll be fine. You mentioned personnel, AJ. It's harsh to say, but moral failure is not the only reason why a church could feasibly remove a staff person.
Yeah.
If someone is not pulling their weight, we're talking about what isn't getting discipleship results. If you're investing a lot of money in personnel dollars into a staff person who's not yielding discipleship results, that is a poor investment on your part, and you do not have an obligation to them to keep them on your payroll. You just don't. Right.
Or move that over to a benevolence line item if that's what we're doing at that point.
That's right. Yeah. Don't consider it personnel, consider it benevolence, because that's what you're doing. You are not there to subsidize failure long term. You're just not. And so this idea of defunding what isn't getting discipleship results is really important. That is key to ministries. It's also key to looking at your personnel and your operations. There's savings to be had there as well. So point 3, the third strategy. So first, let's recap real fast. The first thing we need to do, AJ, is we want to budget under our means. So under budget to alleviate some pressure. Second thing we want to do is we want to defund what isn't getting discipleship results. So the first thing is we're going to budget for less. The second point is, how can we do that? How can we budget for less? Well, we can starve things that aren't getting results. The third step here, AJ, the third strategy, is to choose some things to fund that are beyond just our operational cost. And so this is what we can do with some of our savings, but also if we were to have extra money. So if we go, okay, well, we have a surplus, what are the kinds of things that we could fund? So I would bake some of these goals, AJ, into the budget, even the reduced budget. But then you can also have particularly capital expenses that you choose to fund as a result of any surplus that are visionary and will drive you towards who you want to be and increase your effectiveness.
Yeah.
So we work with AJ in strategic envisioning. We work with churches to choose vision focused goals that go above and beyond just the normal course of operations. So let's talk to me a little bit about why do we do that and how can we be sure we're funding those things properly?
Yeah, vision focused goal. If we've got a plan for what we want to achieve, then we want to provide the resources so that we can achieve it and even exceed it. So having a discipleship pathway that's developed for accomplishing something, maturing people in their faith, then we need to look at each component of that and say, well, what are the actions, the systems, the functions that are happening at each step of the way? And what does it take to fund that to a point that we will see the results that we're after? So that's what we're talking about here in this point. So, that requires really having a close look and having a plan at the ministries of the church. You can't just assume things are going to get results without planning for them.
Yeah, I worked with this past weekend. It's fresh on my mind. I was working with a small denomination of churches that's mostly based in California, and in my work with them this weekend, we identified one of the things they're going to work on is paring down the number of denominational events that they have in the year, which carries a real material cost to them. But because so that's more like point 2 in defunding certain things. But one of the value adds from doing that is if they're not spending that much money on those events, then they're going to be able to have the funds to do a different project, which is the development and implementation of a new leadership development process that they want to kind of put out to these churches. If they're spending all that money on those events, AJ, that they're used to doing every year, they don't have the money to invest in this leadership development process. But putting that leadership development process in place is far more valuable than maintaining the events that they've done every year, which is not creating a return for them in terms of discipleship as an organization.
And this is also an area in which, so especially for you faith budgeters, that you would have a hard time not having that increase. On paper, you should have a plan for, if we have an increase, where would we spend that money? How would we spend that money? Mm-hmm. And so this is a great way, of incorporating that into the budget. If we've got ministry goals and we say, I think we can achieve this with this amount of money. If we get more, that will allow us to do X, Y, and Z over here. That's right. Abundance planning, so that when you've got that money,
that is faith. That's faith, right? Hey, in faith, we believe we're going to bring in more than what we need to operate. And when God does that, what are we going to step out in faith in?
Yeah.
Don't hoard. I'm not recommending that you hoard cash.
No,
I'm not recommending that. But if you are smart in your budgeting so that you cover your needs, then you have the extra to step into things that you feel like you can take a risk on it. Mm-hmm. Right? You have no room to step out in faith and take a risk on something if you are needing every penny just to cover the necessities.
Yeah.
So counter to what the thinking, this enables walking in faith. It doesn't restrict walking in faith.
Yeah. Over the last year, you've seen this too, Scott. I've seen churches, because people, committed givers in the church, wanted to make sure that the church was okay financially. A lot of churches still saw decline, but we saw trend lines increasing on finance in 2020 because people, rightly so, they were worried and they're like, what, I want to make sure that our church is good, and actually ended up taking in more money than would be in a typical year. And I'm working on a church ministry analysis report right now, and that's the case. Their trend line for finance, it was opposite of the trend line for attendance. They had fewer people in attendance last year and an increase in giving. Well, where's that increase going to go to? And most churches would not have a plan for that already.
No plan.
And that's important, because a little bit of extra cash sitting in the bank is going to have, everybody on staff mouth watering, like, here's what I could do with that. And so you plan for that ahead of time, and plan for spending that on the things that are bearing the greatest ministry fruit. And it doesn't mean that, hey, gang, we ended up with 3% over, so we're going to divide it evenly. Everyone
gets a bonus.
More.
No.
Yeah. That's not how we reach our goals. We reach our goals by funding the things that do the best, and continuing to pour into that. And so that's why the budget every year is not supposed to be copy and paste. It's supposed to be dynamic. It's supposed to be something in which we're monitoring our ministry situations throughout the year, and we're building up the things that are working well, and we're cutting back on the things that don't. This is church fine tuning. And and it's the differentiator between churches that are static or in decline and those that thrive. Among other things, but you can do this. And now is the time to begin thinking about it.
Yeah. Let's just cast a little vision for you guys. Imagine budgeting below your means, which in the moment might be stressful, but throughout the rest of the year is going to make you much less stressed about what's coming in every week. Imagine stripping away the stuff that doesn't work, that you've been spending money on. And I know that there's some of you churches that are listening to this and going, we're already on a shoestring budget. Yeah. I understand that, and I empathize with you. But there are a lot of the churches who are listening you're not on a shoestring budget. You know that there's pork in there, that you just haven't been willing to make a change because you don't want to upset somebody. Well, buddy, today's the day. This year's the year. Let's defund things that are not working and that aren't working, so that you can then reinvest those funds into things that are going to drive your church forward, so that you can do things you've never been able to do before, so that you can see results in ministries that you haven't seen results in years. And then imagine having a surplus at the end of the year that you can invest into projects that you've strategically chosen that are going to drive health in the next year. And then imagine repeating that process year after year, always budgeting below your means so that you're always in a surplus, so that you're always able to reinvest into new things, into visionary things. What would your church look like if that was your situation? You weren't stressed about the money every single month. What could it be like? What would your ministry be like if you weren't stressed? Now, to bring this full circle, AJ, I just want to say it starts with pastors. You have to start caring about the budget process. Mm-hmm. And you have to start getting involved, maybe more involved than you've ever been, because the folks who are there on your finance team, I'm sure they're great people with good hearts, but they need your perspective. They need your insight. They need to hear from you as the pastor. They need to hear from your staff in order to have the right information to build a good budget for your church. I'm not suggesting that you get rid of your finance team. I want to be clear about that. But it should be a partnership with you as the pastor and with your staff. It should not be a unilateral thing that happens, for sure.
There you go. Well, this was a good talk on how to strategize for maintaining what you can do with the resources that you have and how to do better with it. Next week, come back again. We're going to finish up our little mini 2-part series on this when we're talking more on strategies for increase. So putting the two together could be a game changer for your ministry. This was episode 103 of the Church Revitalization Podcast, and you can read today's show notes at malfersgroup.com/103. We're also available over there on the YouTube. If you would subscribe to the Malfers Group channel there and click the bell to get notifications, then you could get the video version of this, which is great for watching with staff and leadership teams. There will be some discussion questions.
And with your finance team.
Your finance team. There'll be some discussion questions over there in the video description that would also facilitate some great discussion with your team. So come back next week for our conclusion on this topic on budget increase and vision accomplishment. It's going to be another great talk. Thanks for being with us. We are excited to have you, as always, praying for your church and for your ministry. And we're looking forward to seeing you back next week.